Translator's Foreword. Pleasures of Philosophy. This is a book that speaks of many things, of ticks and quilts and fuzzy subjects and noology and political economy. It is difficult to know how to approach it. What do you do with a book that dedicates an entire chapter to music and animal behavior and then claims that it isn't a chapter? That presents itself as a network of plateaus that are precisely dated but can be read in any order, that deploys a complex technical vocabulary drawn from a wide range of disciplines in the sciences, mathematics, and the humanities, but whose authors recommend that you read it as you would listen to a record. Philosophy, nothing but philosophy. Of a bastard line. The annals of official philosophy are populated by bureaucrats of pure reason who speak in the shadow of the despot and are in historical complicity with the state. They invent a properly spiritual, absolute state that effectively functions in the mind. Theirs is the discourse of sovereign judgment, of stable subjectivity legislated by good sense, of rock-like identity, universal truth, and white male justice. Thus the exercise of their thought is in conformity with the aims of the real state, with the dominant significations, and with the requirements of the established order. Gilles Deleuze was schooled in that philosophy. The titles of his earliest books read like a who's who of philosophical giants. What got me by during that period was conceiving of the history of philosophy as a kind of ass-fuck, or what amounts to the same thing, an immaculate conception. I imagined myself approaching an author from behind and giving him a child that would indeed be his, but would nonetheless be monstrous. Hegel is absent, being too despicable to merit even a mutant offspring. To Kant, he dedicated an affectionate study of an enemy. Yet much of positive value came of Deleuze's flirtation with the greats. He discovered an orphan line of thinkers who were tied by no direct descendants, but were united in their opposition to the state philosophy that would nevertheless accord them minor positions in its canon. Between Lucretius, Hume, Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Bergson, there exists a secret link constituted by the critique of negativity, the cultivation of joy, the hatred of interiority, the exteriority of forces and relations, the denunciation of power. Deleuze's first major statements, written in his own voice, Différence et Répétition, 1968, and Logique du Son, 1969, cross-fertilized that line of nomad thought with contemporary theory. The ferment of the student-worker revolt of May 1968 and the reassessment it prompted of the role of the intellectual in society led him to disclaim the ponderous academic apparatus still in evidence in those works. However, many elements of the philosophy of difference they elaborated were transfused into a continuing collaboration, of which 1,000 Plateaus is the most recent product. Félix Guattari is a practicing psychoanalyst and lifelong political activist. He has worked since the mid-1950s at Laing, an experimental psychiatric clinic founded by Lacanian analyst Jean Oury. Guattari himself was among Lacan's earliest trainees, and although he never severed his ties with Lacan's Freudian school, the group therapy practiced at Laing took him in a very different direction. The aim at Laing was to abolish the hierarchy between doctor and patient in favor of an interactive group dynamic that would bring the experiences of both to full expression in such a way as to produce a collective critique of the power relations in society as a whole. The central perspective is to promote human relations that do not automatically fall into roles or stereotypes, but open onto fundamental relations of a metaphysical kind that bring out the most radical and basic alienations of madness or neurosis, and channel them into revolutionary practice. Guattari collaborated, beginning in 1960, on group projects dedicated to developing this radical institutional psychotherapy, and later entered an uneasy alliance with the international anti-psychiatry movement spearheaded by R.D. Laing in England and Franco Basaglia in Italy. As Lacanian schools of psychoanalysis gained ground against psychiatry, the contractual Oedipal relationship between the analyst and the transference-bound analysand became as much of a target for Guattari as the legal bondage of the institutionalized patient in the conventional state hospital. He came to occupy the same position in relation to psychoanalysis as he had all along in relation to the parties of the left, an ultra-opposition within the opposition. His anti-hierarchical leanings made him a precursor to the events of May 1968 and an early partisan of the social movements that grew from them, including feminism and the gay rights movement. Anti-Oedipus, 1972, his first book with Deleuze, gave philosophical weight to his convictions and created one of the intellectual sensations of post-war France with its spirited polemics against state-happy or pro-party versions of Marxism and school-building strains of psychoanalysis, which separately and in various combinations represented the dominant intellectual currents of the time, in spite of the fundamentally anarchist nature of the spontaneous popular uprisings that had shaken the world in 1968. The most tangible result of Anti-Oedipus was that it short-circuited the connection between psychoanalysis and the far-left parties, in which he and Deleuze saw the potential for a powerful new bureaucracy of analytic reason. For many French intellectuals, the hyperactivism of post-May gave way to a mid-70s slump, then a return to religion, tel quel, or political conservatism, the nouveau philosophe, in a foreshadowing of the Reagan 80s. Deleuze and Guattari never recanted, nor did they simply revive the polemics. 1,000 Plateaus, 1980, written over a 7-year period, was billed as a sequel to Anti-Oedipus and shares its subtitle, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, but it constitutes a very different project. It is less a critique than a positive exercise in the affirmative nomad thought called for in Anti-Oedipus. State philosophy is another word for the representational thinking that has characterized Western metaphysics since Plato, but has suffered an at least momentary setback during the last quarter century at the hands of Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and post-structuralist theory generally. As described by Deleuze, it reposes on a double identity, of the thinking subject, and of the concepts it creates, and to which it lends its own presumed attributes of sameness and constancy. The subject, its concepts, and also the objects in the world to which the concepts are applied, have a shared internal essence, the self-resemblance at the basis of identity. Representational thought is analogical. Its concern is to establish a correspondence between these symmetrically structured domains. The faculty of judgment is the policeman of analogy, assuring that each of the three terms is honestly itself, and that the proper correspondences obtain. In thought, its end is truth. In action, justice. The weapons it wields in their pursuit are limitative distribution, the determination of the exclusive set of properties possessed by each term in contradistinction to the others, logos, law, and hierarchical ranking, the measurement of the degree of perfection of a term's self-resemblance in relation to a supreme standard, man, God, or gold, value, morality. The modus operandi is negation. X equals not Y. Identity, resemblance, truth, justice, and negation, the rational foundation for order. The established order, of course. Philosophers have traditionally been employees of the state. The collusion between philosophy and the state was most explicitly enacted in the first decade of the 19th century with the foundation of the University of Berlin, which was to become the model for higher learning throughout Europe and in the United States. The goal laid out for it by Wilhelm von Humboldt, based on proposals by Fichte and Schleiermacher, was the spiritual and moral training of the nation to be achieved by deriving everything from an original principle, truth, by relating everything to an ideal, justice, and by unifying this principle and this ideal in a single idea, the state. The end product would be a fully legitimated subject of knowledge and society, each mind an analogously organized mini-state, morally unified in the supermind of the state. Prussian mind meld. More insidious than the well-known practical cooperation between university and government, the burgeoning military funding of research, is its philosophical role in the propagation of the form of representational thinking itself, that properly spiritual absolute state endlessly reproduced and disseminated at every level of the social fabric. Deconstruction-influenced feminists such as Hélène Cixous and Luce Irigaray have attacked it under the name phallogocentrism. What the most privileged model of rock-like identity is goes without saying. In the introduction to 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari describe it as the arborescent model of thought, the proudly erect tree under whose spreading boughs latter-day Plateaus conduct their class. Nomad thought does not immure itself in the edifice of an ordered interiority. It moves freely in an element of exteriority. It does not repose on identity. It rides difference. It does not respect the artificial division between the three domains of representation, subject, concept, and being. It replaces restrictive analogy with a conductivity that knows no bounds. The concepts it creates do not merely reflect the eternal form of a legislating subject, but are defined by a communicable force in relation to which their subject, to the extent that they can be said to have one, is only secondary. They do not reflect upon the world, but are immersed in a changing state of things. A concept is a brick. It can be used to build the courthouse of reason, or it can be thrown through the window. What is the subject of the brick? The arm that throws it? The body connected to the arm? The brain encased in the body? The situation that brought brain and body to such a juncture? All and none of the above. What is its object? The window, the edifice, the laws the edifice shelters, the class and other power relations encrusted in the laws? All and none of the above. What interests us are the circumstances. Because the concept, in its unrestrained usage, is a set of circumstances at a volatile juncture. It is a vector, the point of application of a force moving through a space at a given velocity in a given direction. The concept has no subject or object other than itself. It is an act. Nomad thought replaces the closed equation representation x equals not y, I equals not u, with an open equation. Plus y, plus z, plus a, plus arm, plus brick, plus window, plus... Rather than analyzing the world into discrete components, reducing their manyness to the one of identity and ordering them by rank, it sums up a set of disparate circumstances in a shattering blow. It synthesizes a multiplicity of elements without effacing their heterogeneity or hindering their potential for future rearranging. To the contrary, the modus operandi of nomad thought is affirmation, even when its apparent object is negative. Force is not to be confused with power. Force arrives from outside to break constraints and open new vistas. Power builds walls. The space of nomad thought is qualitatively different from state space. Air against earth. State space is striated or gridded. Movement in it is confined, as by gravity, to a horizontal plane, and limited by the order of that plane to preset paths between fixed and identifiable points. Nomad space is smooth or open-ended. One can rise up at any point and move to any other. Its mode of distribution is the nomos, arraying oneself in an open space, hold the street, as opposed to the logos of entrenching oneself in a closed space, hold the fort. 1,000 Plateaus is an effort to construct a smooth space of thought. It is not the first such attempt. Like state philosophy, nomad thought goes by many names. Spinoza called it ethics, Nietzsche called it the gay science, Artaud called it crowned anarchy. To Maurice Blanchot, it is the space of literature. To Foucault, outside thought. In this book, Deleuze and Guattari employ the terms pragmatics and schizoanalysis, and in the introduction describe a rhizome network strangling the roots of the infamous tree. One of the points of the book is that nomad thought is not confined to philosophy, or that the kind of philosophy it is comes in many forms. Filmmakers and painters are philosophical thinkers to the extent that they explore the potentials of their respective mediums and break away from the beaten paths. On a strictly formal level, it is mathematics and music that create the smoothest of the smooth spaces. In fact, Deleuze and Guattari would probably be more inclined to call philosophy music with content than music a rarefied form of philosophy. Which returns to our opening question. How should 1,000 Plateaus be played? When you buy a record, there are always cuts that leave you cold. You skip them. You don't approach a record as a closed book that you have to take or leave. Other cuts you may listen to over and over again. They follow you. You find yourself humming them under your breath as you go about your daily business. 1,000 Plateaus is conceived as an open system. It does not pretend to have the final word. The author's hope, however, is that elements of it will stay with a certain number of its readers and will weave into the melody of their everyday lives. Each plateau is an orchestration of crashing bricks extracted from a variety of disciplinary edifices. They carry traces of their former emplacement, which give them a spin defining the arc of their vector. The vectors are meant to converge at a volatile juncture, but one that is sustained as an open equilibrium of moving parts, each with its own trajectory. The word plateau comes from an essay by Gregory Bateson on Balinese culture, in which he found a libidinal economy quite different from the West's orgasmic orientation. In Deleuze and Guattari, a plateau is reached when circumstances combine to bring an activity to a pitch of intensity that is not automatically dissipated in a climax. The heightening of energies is sustained long enough to leave a kind of afterimage of its dynamism that can be reactivated or injected into other activities, creating a fabric of intensive states between which any number of connecting routes could exist. Each section of 1,000 Plateaus tries to combine conceptual bricks in such a way as to construct this kind of intensive state of thought. The way the combination is made is an example of what Deleuze and Guattari call consistency, not in the sense of a homogeneity, but as a holding together of disparate elements, also known as a style. A style, in this sense, as a dynamic holding together or mode of composition, is not something limited to writing. Filmmakers, painters, and musicians have their styles, mathematicians have theirs, rocks have style, and so do tools and technologies and historical periods, even, especially, punctual events. Each section is dated because each tries to reconstitute a dynamism that has existed in other mediums at other times. The date corresponds to the point at which it was freest from interference from other modes and rose to its highest degree of intensity. That never lasts more than a flash, because the world rarely leaves room for uncommon intensity, being in large measure an entropic trashbin of outworn modes that refuse to die. Section 12, for example, the treatise on nomadology, is dated 1227 AD, because that is when the nomad war machine existed for a moment in its pure form on the vacant, smooth spaces of the steppes of Inner Asia. The reader is invited to follow each section to the plateau that rises from the smooth space of its composition, and to move from one plateau to the next at pleasure. But it is just as good to ignore the heights. You can take a concept that is particularly to your liking and jump with it to its next appearance. They tend to cycle back. Some might call that repetitious. Deleuze and Guattari call it a refrain. Most of all, the reader is invited to lift a dynamism out of the book entirely and incarnate it in a foreign medium, whether it be painting or politics. The authors steal from other disciplines with glee, but they are more than happy to return the favor. Deleuze's own image for a concept is not a brick, but a toolbox. He calls his kind of philosophy pragmatics, because its goal is the invention of concepts that do not add up to a system of belief or an architecture of propositions that you either enter or you don't, but instead pack a potential in the way a crowbar in the willing hand envelops an energy of prying. The best way of all to approach the book is to read it as a challenge, to pry open the vacant spaces that would enable you to build your life and those of the people around you into a plateau of intensity that would leave after images of its dynamism that could be re-injected into still other lives, creating a fabric of heightened states between which any number, the greatest number, of connecting roots would exist. Some might call that promiscuous. Deleuze and Guattari call it revolution. The question is not, is it true, but does it work? What new thoughts does it make it possible to think? What new emotions does it make it possible to feel? What new sensations and perceptions does it open in the body? The answer for some readers, perhaps most, will be none. If that happens, it's not your tune. No problem. But you would have been better off buying a record.